we hope to have a great conversation today. So, welcome, Kelsie. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do, what brought you to this work, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Um, as you said, my name's Kelsie Massini. I use she, her pronouns. I am the legal projects manager at PCADV.
Mhm.
So I actually started my work at Turning Point of Lehigh Valley. I was an intern there. I worked as a legal advocate in shelter and on the helpline.
Mhm.
It's where I received my 40 hours of domestic violence training. And that was when I was in my undergraduate degree. And it really made me realize that while the work legal advocates do is invaluable, having an attorney in the room to represent survivors can really change the course of some of these cases. So I decided to go to law school. And out of law school, I started at another member program where I directly represented survivors in protection orders, in custody support and divorce cases. And then it's been about 6 years now that I've been at PCADV.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so here I run our statewide legal helpline for victims of crime. So I talk to survivors and victims of crime every day and give general legal information and guidance about same thing, protection orders, and then a lot of family law matters, so custody, divorce, um, support, some housing. And then
Mhm.
I also oversee what we call our civil legal representation project. So that is kind of think of many law offices that are funded in domestic violence programs throughout the state, where to fund attorneys to directly represent survivors in court. So I was previously at a CLR, and now I oversee that project at PCADV.
Awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. And you're right. There's always a benefit to having like a legal representation of some sort or some sort of trained um legal attorney, etc., in the room because there's often that overlap of custody, of divorce, of, various items. So, yeah, what do you see like most often being the intersection between abuse and
Oh, it's all consuming with family law. It feels like it because like you said, it's all so interconnected. So
Mhm.
often now in the role that I have, sometimes, similar to a helpline at a program where maybe the first call someone's making and they're saying, I'm recognizing these signs of abuse. I'm
Mhm.
considering leaving X where maybe we're
What do I
married,
do?
maybe we're not, we have children. Um, this is what the support looks like. What
Yeah.
do I need to start thinking about, right? Because then all these laws come into play and affect how, and someone may be able to move if they're able to move out of county, out of state, um, if a protection order is helpful or not in their situation. So I think, once, especially once children are involved,
Mhm.
it becomes much more complex. And the way that we see the abuse and power dynamics continue after the relationship has ended, but if there's continuing custody of minor children is sometimes all consuming and for the court system lasts until the children are 18, but in reality lasts a lifetime
Yeah.
when you share children. So that's definitely the biggest piece. And I think what sometimes is missed out on is the fact that as attorneys, we can start to address a lot of these issues at the protection order stage.
Hmm.
If we are representing a survivor at that stage, if not, then you need to address it down the line, and you still may need to. But protection orders are a unique place where we can address a lot of topics
Yeah.
in one court case sometimes.
Yeah. So you had mentioned with, especially with the overlap of children and everything, that a lot of times it starts early and it obviously continues the rest of their life, really. So I guess what are some early warning signs of abuse, of stalking specifically? What behaviors might we see that we should have that red flag going off in our head, like, oh, this is bad. I should probably start reaching out for support. What would you point out for people to think about?
Yeah, to me, it's so often those what some people might see as minor, but to us sometimes in the movement are not those early kind of controlling signs that we see. So the constant check-ins is a big one. Um, it can seem pretty romantic at the start sometimes, but if someone's texting you and calling you constantly, and a lot of their questions are, where are you? What are you doing? Where are you at
Mhm.
now? Who are you with? The need to know where you are at all times
Mhm.
is not necessarily the sign of a healthy relationship. And then, kind of with that, again, if it's early stages, it can seem romantic showing up where you are,
Mhm.
surprising you at places, but you're not quite sure why they know where you are or how they know where
Mhm.
you are. Um, those to me are
Mhm.
definitely some of the first signs where I start to get worried if I hear someone talking about them.
Yeah. I guess we should backtrack too. So obviously with abuse, we're typically looking for this pattern of power and control. But with stalking specifically, like how would you define that both from a legal perspective and just in general from an advocacy perspective?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think
Sorry, throwing you for a curveball.
no, you're not. I think, this is one of, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more as we go on.
Mhm.
I think stalking is an area where, as an advocate perspective, we would define it one way, and then from the legal perspective, it's
Mhm.
defined another way oftentimes,
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah.
which leads to some of the shortfalls of our legal protections for
Yeah.
stalking survivors. Um, hmm. But again, I think, it still is that power and control, but it just is exhibiting in a slightly different way sometimes. So it's the constant check-ins, but then often there can start to be some retribution or reaction depending on your response,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
So if you don't respond, what does that look like?
Mhm.
I was saying I was in meetings all morning, and my spouse, their text messages have gone unanswered, of course. And
Right.
that they're used to it. It happens. It's I'm caught up in my day. But oftentimes in these situations, that's the phone calls then start increasing in frequency. Have they now started calling your job because you're not answering your cell phone, or started
Mhm.
checking in with other people based on that? And then how do they treat you when you see them because you didn't check in with them during the
Mhm.
day? So it starts to escalate sometimes in those small ways, and it can be presented as, well, if you love me, you would just, I just was worried about you. Why didn't you
Right.
respond? But then they can be very cold or very harsh um, if you don't respond in the manner or with the
Mhm.
frequency that they would like you to.
Mhm. How do you think that would show up with a former partner stalking?
I think it, there's kind of two sides to that we see. We see um, the side where it's presented as, or not even presented, but can feel like, okay, well, we just went through this breakup. Maybe
Mhm.
they want to reconcile, or they're just trying to make sense of the breakup. I remember so vividly a horrible PFA case I had that was really about stalking, and the judge was like, "Oh, it's a bad breakup." I'm like, "This is not a bad breakup.
Okay.
People don't show up to your home, call your work, do all these things in a bad breakup." But I think it can be seen as, okay, I'm just reaching out to try and understand what went wrong. Or especially if you live together, oh, there's belongings at your house, or
Mhm.
the dog, I want to check in on the dog we shared, or
Mhm.
some of these things. Um, Leaving flowers because I'm trying to make it up to you and I want to
Right.
get back together with you. So I think there's that side. And then sometimes there's the, what can be seen more as like the vindictive
Mm,
side, where it's not as much about making connection with
mm-hmm,
the individual or trying to get them back, but more letting them know, like
mm-hmm.
keeping tabs, letting them know that
Yeah.
you're watching, more threatening. Not, they're both threatening things, right?
Right.
And this
Right.
is something we'll talk about more, but more what can be perceived as like overtly threatening,
Yeah.
or posting a lot about the individual on social media. Um, we've even seen like posting flyers, posting things in the community, about the survivor that again is very negative and vindictive versus this like
Mm-hmm,
what can be seen as trying to be loving and reconciling a relationship
mm-hmm.
that has ended.
Almost trying to like regain that control and
Yeah.
regain that connection. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, it's a lot of times it seems like it stems into actions that cause fear in some
Yeah.
way, where there's that, like you said, that leaving of gifts or that, like, hey, I can find you, kind of like, I know what you did last summer, that sort of
Hmm.
vibe of like, I know, and I'm going to expose whatever about you, or I'm going to find you when you think you're safe so that you know that you're not safe, that kind of vibe.
Hmm.
Um, but like you said, a lot of times people tend to dismiss it and as a bad breakup, as just a little spat with the wife, with the husband, or whatever. Yeah. And why do you think there is this dismissal of stalking dynamics that we see them often as like romantic or harmless or just annoying? Like, yeah, how do we support survivors for when people start to minimize what they're experiencing?
I think part of it is the media, right?
Mhm.
Like the way that sometimes we see love play out in shows or in rom-coms or is like very problematic,
Yeah.
but it's presented as extremely romantic. So I think that has, not saying, the media is the cause of this or anything, but I
Right.
think it certainly feeds into perception.
Yeah.
And then I think, so much of it falls back on, in general, some of these misconceptions that as a society we have about abuse, and that abuse looks like one very specific thing. A victim or survivor, has to act a certain way, has to respond a certain way to things. And so I think sometimes as a community, when we start to recognize, oh, these other things are concerning, maybe it then kind of threatens your own perspective. And you have to say, like, oh, well, maybe some of these experiences I had that I wrote off as being fine were maybe not okay. And we don't often want to approach that or think about it that way. So it's easier to just say, "Oh, they're flowers. Why would you be worried about getting flowers? That's so lovely. That's such a nice thing." Or, oh, they
Mhm.
left a note on your car in this parking lot. Like, it's a love letter. What's so threatening about that? So I think it's, again, kind of just in general, something we deal with abuse, where it's people very much have a stereotype in their head and a perception of what it looks like. And then also kind of the media feeding into that as well, for
Oh, wow.
sure. I didn't watch it, so I can't speak to it, but I know like I hear all the time you like the TV show,
Hmm.
people love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, I haven't watched it, can't tell you you shouldn't love it.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
just have seen like the main actor being like, do not love my character. Like, this is
Yes.
so concerning.
He's been very outspoken about that and that
Yeah.
it was very difficult for him to take on that stalker role because, like, yeah, it was, I would argue, I have seen you, and I would argue that it was dramatized for sure for media. But at the same time, like a lot of the power and control dynamics of stalking and whatnot that were portrayed is something that, people do go through. But yeah, he definitely has spoken up about this is not good. Don't romanticize this,
Yeah.
please.
I think too, like
Um,
so many little things about stalking or how it can be used currently are introduced to us in what seem like harmless ways, right?
yeah,
Like
that
you
was my
think
next
of air
question.
tags or a lot of things that are presented as, oh, a way to monitor your kids or a way to do
Hmm.
this. And so it just like become such a part of our life and everyday life
Uh-huh.
that then, you know, when I talk to survivors a lot, they're like, "Oh, you're gonna think this sounds like a movie." And to me, I'm like, "No, this sounds like I hear it every day." But like I understand why people feel that way because again, it's like people are like, "Oh, how is this harmful?" It's I use it for all these helpful things and then don't see that it can be kind of switched and used in this other
Yeah.
manner.
Yeah. Are there any specific like digital or online behaviors that you've especially seen people minimize that maybe like we see them as normal online interaction, but maybe should be like, oh, that's not the healthiest. We should probably stop doing that. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, to me, the location sharing, the prevalency of that really stresses me out. Again, I
Hmm.
think just coming from this field, it's so, again, presented in such a way where it's super easy. And of course, if people you care about, why wouldn't you share your location with them? I am guilty. I keep my location services off. And
Hmm.
like my nephew likes to see everyone on the
Where
map and
people are
gets
on his map.
upset that
Yep.
I don't share my location. And I'm like, on principle,
Oh.
I just won't do it. It's very stressful to me. Um, and again, not that that's a red flag on its own, but I think it can then be used in a way that's a little bit different. I think the red flags to me are, you know, again, when people are starting to be able to access information about you
Hmm.
that you don't think you've shared with them or haven't
Yeah.
openly made them privy to. Especially social media is like a big piece where we see this, where
Yeah.
okay, now they've started to create a fake profile or found other ways to access the stuff that you think you might be sharing
Hmm.
privately.
Hmm.
But they're now finding out a lot more about you than you thought you had given them access to.
Yeah. And I think that's the fear too with like our digital world now that so many of us are online, put information about ourselves online that anyone could find out. Ultimately, anything that you post can be found. So if somebody is an abuser, a stalker, and is trying to do harm to you, it's very easy to find information about anyone, and it can be very dangerous that something as simple as, I don't know, like where you work or I don't know what an event you might be at or whatnot. It's so scary how prevalent those things are that we kind of overlook. And
Mhm.
I think also too, of course I lost my train of thought, but the it becomes such a gray area too when it comes to the legal side of things because like I've heard people share, well, I had this person that was trying to talk to me, I blocked them, but then they made new accounts, like you said, or they called me with different phone numbers and I don't know that it's them, but I know it's them, you
Yeah.
know? And a lot of times if you go to law enforcement, go for legal protections, it's like just keep blocking them or
Yeah.
just don't respond to them. Let them know that you don't want to talk to them. And it feels right from a survivor perspective or from a community perspective that that's really all the protections that are in place.
Mhm.
So can we talk about like what legal protections people can't have when there's stalking involved?
Yeah, and so I think, you know, first that piece we just talked about is, you know, a difficulty with the criminal code. And part of that is the standard in criminal cases, if you've watched TV, is right beyond a reasonable doubt. It's this really high burden that we have to prove. And the issue so often with social media or with phones when people use spoofing or are blocking their number
Mhm,
to make it
mhm,
seem like it's someone else calling you is the proof element of it, right? Like, how do we prove that it came from this specific person? And yes, in an ideal world, we have a lot of technology and can spend the hours and hours and hours to, you know, track IP addresses and
mhm.
get phone records and stuff. But the reality is that that often isn't what law enforcement is able to do. So it makes it really hard in criminal cases. Now, we have some civil protections as well,
Mhm.
and that varies a little bit depending on the situation. So the main one that often comes up if it's an intimate partner or former intimate partner relationship, or even a family member sometimes, is going to be our protection from abuse order, what we commonly call PFA for short in Pennsylvania. So that is a civil protection order that can be in place for up to 3 years, and it can order someone not to abuse, stalk, harass, or threaten um, the plaintiff or the victim in the case. It also often orders that there's no contact with the
Mhm.
individual and that you don't go to where they live, where they work, where they might go to school.
Mhm.
Um, it's not how we think of some states have like, or we just think of, oh, it's a set amount of space or distance with the
Mhm.
person. Pennsylvania doesn't have that specifically. Um,
Okay.
but it's the no contact piece and not coming to where they are. And recently, we've had our appeals courts in Pennsylvania really recognize some of the harm around social media. So previously, we could get violations for a PFA if someone directly like messaged you or reached out to
Mhm.
you on social media. But it's been a few years ago now. We had a case where the defendant was posting pictures of their matching tattoos, alluding to
Mhm.
the plaintiff on their own Facebook page, and about the case, not mentioning the plaintiff specifically by name. But the
Like
court in that
roundabout
case,
contact. Yeah.
yeah, the
Yeah.
court in
Yeah.
that case actually issued a really great opinion talking about how, no, this is a continuation of power and control,
Yeah.
and we should f hold people responsible for violating a PFA for
Mhm.
that type of posting comments or images about the plaintiff, even
Mhm.
if it isn't direct contact. So that was a really big move forward that we
Yeah.
had in the law recently. And I think a sign that the court is starting to recognize the shift with social media and how um, that stalking and that abuse can continue in ways that might look different than they did
Mhm.
previously when, contact may have been more straightforward contact.
Yeah. Are there other legal protections as far as civil, concerns that maybe you want to mention? I know we were talking a little bit earlier, yeah, about some of the other.
Yeah, so there's also two other protection orders that Pennsylvania specifically has. So we have what we call our sexual violence protection orders, and
Mhm.
then our protection from abuse orders.
Mhm.
So I'll start with the protection from a, or sorry, not from
Intimidation.
abuse, from
Yeah, yeah,
intimidation.
yeah.
Our PFIs, protection from intimidation, is the one we kind of think of often as being so straightforward when it comes to stalking because it's specifically meant to address when there's harassment and intimidation.
Mhm.
However, it is written
Mhm.
very specifically where the victim in the case has to be a minor, so under the age of 18, and
Mhm.
the defendant in the case has to be an adult, so 18 or older.
Mhm.
Um, it was, I think, originally added to the law based on this idea of, oh, maybe there's a coach who starts to
Mhm.
harass a minor who's on their team or something
Mhm.
of that idea. So it's very narrow. It's great when it's helpful, but it also, you can't be a family member, an intimate partner, or anything.
Yeah.
And then our sexual violence protection orders are for when there has been an incident of sexual violence or sexual
Mhm.
harassment, and there's a continued risk of harm to the plaintiff. So, again, how it was originally, I think, written for is if you think of, an on-campus sexual
Mhm.
assault between individuals who were not intimate partners, and now that defendant's contacting you
Mhm.
when you don't want them to be. That's a situation where someone could file a sexual violence protection order.
Mhm.
Um, so those are really helpful, but they are very, not very narrow, but they're narrow. Our protection
Yeah.
orders in Pennsylvania are are written very specifically for certain circumstances, certain relationships that need to be had or not had to qualify. So they are amazing forms of protection when someone qualifies and is eligible for them, but they unfortunately, especially in stalking situations, do not always cover every survivor or victim who's seeking protection.
Yeah.
The one other piece I'll mention, and it's nowhere near the same level of protection as a protection order, but something I talk
Hmm.
to folks about a lot as an option is something that's sometimes people call it a cease and desist. I often call it
Hmm.
a defiant trespass letter, a no
Hmm.
contact letter.
Hmm.
Defiant trespass is a crime in Pennsylvania. It's a crime when you specifically tell someone not to come to your property and they come to your property anyways.
Gotcha.
So it's a very specific crime, but as attorneys, we will sometimes send these letters in situations where there's been stalking and harassment. It might not quite rise to the level where we feel confident in getting a protection order, or the survivor doesn't want a protection order for whatever reason.
Hmm.
Um, but we send this letter, especially if it's someone who maybe actually cares about authority or would take a letter from an attorney or something that comes from the police seriously.
Hmm.
And it will say you're specifically not allowed to come to where this person lives or works.
Hmm. Hmm.
We'll also usually include language that you're not to have any contact with them.
Hmm.
And will include in there if you continue this behavior, you could be charged with harassment or stalking. You could be
Hmm.
charged with defiant trespass, or the plaintiff could possibly file a protection from abuse order
So it's
against you.
essentially like a warning letter,
It's a
like,
warning
hey,
letter, it's a
knock it
paper
off.
trail. It
Right, right.
usually, ideally, you send a copy to your local police department so they have it
Hmm.
on file. Again, I never promise, and I am very upfront if I'm talking to someone about it. It is not the same protections as a protection order
Hmm.
or criminal
Hmm.
charge. And we can talk about this, I'm sure, more
Hmm.
a little bit later, but it's a way sometimes to help build that
Hmm.
paper trail. And
Hmm.
hopefully things don't escalate, but if they do, a way to help then in a future case where you're able to say, look, I already, they very clearly knew not to contact me and they continued to do that. So it's an option I always like to mention,
Hmm.
but also be very clear that it's
It's
not
not a
the
protection
same
order. It's just like a,
protection.
yeah, yeah. What? Oh my gosh. I keep losing my train of thought.
Yeah.
Um, with, okay, so we talked about the PFA, the protection from abuse order, PFI, protection from intimidation, the sexual violence protection order, and the cease and desist letter.
Mhm.
Um, what barriers would you say show up when clients are trying to access these protection orders? I know a lot of times the two pushback comments that I tend to get are it's just a piece of paper. What good is it going to do? Right. And number two, well, I had a PFA, I had an SVPO, whatnot, and, called law enforcement to enforce it because there was a violation and they said nothing could be done. And it's sort of this like, okay, now what? So what do you say to clients that maybe are experiencing those concerns or hesitations to a protection order?
So I don't know if this is the right answer, but I I'm always a believer as an attorney that the best information we can give someone is the honest truth
Hmm.
um about our policies and procedures when they work, when they don't, and then really meeting them where they are in their situation. So I will be the first one to say a protection order is not the best thing for everyone.
Hmm.
And I think survivors often know what's best for them in that situation. But what I will do is have a very open conversation with them about what their concerns are with it. Because,
Hmm.
yes, we so often hear it is just a piece of paper, which it can be seen that way. However, it is a piece
Mhm.
of paper that should, in practice, require immediate police response.
Mhm.
So, unlike another situation where, okay, the defendant's now shown up at my door, I try and call the police and they say, oh, this is a civil matter.
Mhm.
This doesn't really rise to something we can help with. When there's a protection order in place, it should, again, in theory, be an immediate arrest in that
Yeah.
situation because it's a violation of the protection order. Um, so
They
it
have
should,
to,
go
sorry,
ahead.
I was going to
Sorry.
say they have to be caught actually violating, correct? By
Yes,
law
I
enforcement, which is one, yeah.
yeah, so I would say in that situation, if they're at on your property, the PFA
Mhm.
says they're not supposed to be there.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it's a piece of paper that has a lot of really good protections.
Mhm.
One of the main ones coming into play is firearms
Mhm.
relinquishment.
Yeah,
If your
that's true.
defendant or abuser has firearms and you're concerned about them, a
Mhm.
PFA allows for sheriffs and law enforcement to seize those weapons for the duration of the PFA.
Wow.
And that's a piece of stalking I don't talk about to make anyone more fearful, but the reality is that stalking does heighten lethality risk in situations.
Mhm.
So taking weapons away can be a really big thing
Mhm.
sometimes. Now, I've also spoken to survivors who say that's the worst thing I could do is take
Mhm.
away because they'll escalate things, which is why I think it's so important again to really say what are you looking for and what's best for
Mhm.
you. A PFA can also be really customizable, which people don't realize.
Mhm.
Um, so maybe not the stalking relationship, but sometimes I have folks who are married, they live together, they don't necessarily want to not live together, but they want the abuse to stop.
Mhm.
You can have contact. You can allow for contact in a PFA, allow for people to live
Mhm.
together, but have the no abuse, no stalking, no
Mhm.
threatening provision. That's not an ideal situation for most people, but it is for
Right.
some. Um, or, I want to carve out this other piece that I don't want to include it in a PFA, and I don't think people always realize that it can be written to your for the most part, to your specific situation. So,
Mhm.
yes, we have this list of protections you can ask for, but you get to choose which
Mhm.
ones of those you want included and which ones you don't,
Yeah.
um, which can sometimes, when I'm talking to people, alleviate some of their concerns or fears about filing because they didn't
Mhm.
realize that it could look different for them to
For
how
different
it might have
people.
looked for someone else who filed.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Now, law enforcement response to violations is its own piece, and it is unfortunate that sometimes the response is not what we it should be or what we want it to be when someone
Right.
reports a violation. I think to that, I usually just first recognize I'm really sorry that that happened. That shouldn't have
Mhm.
happened the way that it did. Um, Can I connect you to your local program that might help to advocate to law enforcement on your behalf if that's something they offer? Um, can I at least let you know that we constantly do training for any community partners who will have us about PFAs and violations and try and work to make the system better in
Yeah.
ways that we can. But I think, again, I also do address the honest truth, which is sometimes the reaction is not what we want it to be, and the enforcement
Mhm.
is not what it should be. And I think we need to constantly be working on that because we need the enforcement piece to be there for survivors to be able to trust in the system and in the
Yeah.
protections that are in place. There is also an option for the victim in that situation to file the violation themselves.
Mhm.
But it's a difficult option and it's not
Mhm.
my first choice for anyone.
Mhm.
But that is an option that we talk about
That's
sometimes
good to
too.
know. Yeah, yeah, that is good to know. Um, so especially with, some of those stalking situations where, let's say, for example, a student in college is on a dating app, right? And this is nobody specific. I'm just kind of making this up as I go, just for clarity. But let's say somebody is a student in college, is on a dating app, shares their phone number with the person they never meet, but there's clearly that engagement in, dating. But from there, because there's so much information online and stuff as we talked about, right, the other person starts stalking them, harassing them, continuing to monitor what they do online or show up. Like, what protections would be in place for somebody like that, where there's not clearly an intimate partner relationship, but at the same time, there's obviously something going on that is putting the survivor in fear or at risk.
Yeah, so this is the piece where, our laws have their own shortcomings for sure.
Hmm.
I think, something that's kind of unique about our sexual violence protection order law itself is that it's still fairly new.
Hmm.
I think it's less than 10 years old, or it might be coming up on 10 years of being in place. So we're still, as lawyers, as judges, defining the law and
Hmm.
what it looks like. Whereas the PFA Act, oh, it's been in place for, it's got to be, I think, at least 40 years at this point. So
Hmm.
we have
Yeah.
case law talking about what every little word in that means going back a really long time. But for SVPOs, we're still trying to figure that out. So I think in those situations, there's perhaps sometimes an argument that could be made that the person might qualify for a sexual violence protection order.
Hmm.
Now, that order and law is different from the PFA in that it kind
Hmm.
of it links back to the criminal code for definitions of what we consider sexual violence. Um, Sexual harassment is one of the things that is included. Now, you don't
Hmm.
need to have reported to the police or any criminal charges have been pressed, but there has to be some incident that could, in theory, fall under um,
Hmm.
the criminal code definitions. So I think depending on the circumstances,
Yeah.
maybe an SVPO. The
Okay.
continued risk of harm piece of that is often the continued unwanted contact and the stalking.
Hmm.
We also have, again, some really good case law that in cases where there's been a sexual assault has said the
Hmm.
kind of the PTSD response alone of,
Hmm.
that comes with possibly seeing the defendant, even if the defendant doesn't quote unquote mean harm, is a
Hmm.
continued risk of harm in these
Okay.
situations.
Yeah.
Um, so that's a possibility. I think
Hmm.
on campus, you have
Hmm.
other protections too. So
For
on
sure.
campus, Title IX,
Hmm.
and the Title IX office is
For sure. Yeah.
sometimes super helpful in these
Hmm.
situations and separate outside of, the civil and criminal legal
Right.
system that we're used to.
Right.
And I'm certainly not an expert in Title IX, but that
Well,
can,
it's constantly changing
yeah,
too, so it's
yeah.
so, yeah, so in depth.
But that
Yeah.
can also offer protections for um, students experiencing stalking and harassment.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's good to know. Um, if I were a survivor experiencing stalking, what would be the best types of documentation that I could provide to support a protection order or just support me legally?
Yeah. So often I point survivors to uh, what we usually call a stalking log. Now there's
Mm.
really formal versions, formal, like I'm thinking of Spark, which is a stalking awareness organization, has created one that I often direct folks to, and it kind of is a spreadsheet that will say, okay, the incident happened on this date. Here's what happened. Did I report it to the police? Did I not? If I did, it documents that. But it can also be much more informal than that, just keeping track in a notebook that you have or whatever way is most helpful to you. But I find that to be helpful, especially if it's, we haven't talked about the criminal side as much, but both the criminal side and unfortunately sometimes even our protection orders, usually they want a course of conduct or more than one incident sometimes is a requirement of those laws. So being able to, if you do choose to report to law enforcement, show that pattern, show that this is not one incident. Here's everything that's happened and when it's happened, and being able to have some track of that can be really helpful when it comes to um, if it's, things on social media or text messages, um, saving those, even if it's just a screenshot, is extremely helpful to be able to show it. Same thing, we often, obviously, understandably, don't want to keep upsetting things on our phone. So even if it's just sharing it with someone else who can keep that safe for you, a friend or family member who will kind of keep those voicemails, those text messages, those screenshots, photos, if there are any for you, can be really helpful. That way, again, if you do choose to go to law enforcement or if you do choose to file a protection order, you have that evidence available. When we're talking about protection orders specifically, I think there is such a concern that I need this very specific evidence to be able to get a protection order. Um, it's important to know both stalking and abuse and domestic violence often happen behind closed doors. So we sometimes don't have very formal evidence. And
Mhm.
you can get a PFA solely based on your testimony.
Mhm.
You testifying to what occurred and what happened. Yes, evidence is very helpful, and I will be the first to say if you can have it, it's always helpful to have it, but I never want someone to feel like I don't have a police report or I don't have a specific picture of an injury and therefore I can't file a
They're
PFA
not going to
because
take me
that's not the
seriously
case.
if I don't. Yeah, yeah. There's a good question in the chat. What are some of the reasons someone would be denied a PFA?
If we're talking about stalking specifically,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to look at two pieces usually. The first is going to be the relationship piece. So, a protection from abuse order specifically requires you to have a what we call quote unquote qualifying relationship with the defendant. Um, it's usually in short term called family or household member, but that's, I think, a very misleading term because
Mm-hmm.
your roommate, who is a household member, is not someone you can file a PFA against.
Right.
So, specifically, it needs to be a current or former intimate partner, um,
Mm-hmm.
a current or former spouse, who in theory is also a current or former intimate partner, um, someone you share a child with, or a family member. And that can be a family member by either blood or by marriage. So oftentimes in stalking situations, or not often, but in non-intimate partner stalking situations, the individual unfortunately does not meet those very strict relationship requirements. So that's one
Yeah.
piece. And then the second piece comes down to our definition of stalking in the Protection from Abuse Act. So it's actually pulled from Pennsylvania's criminal code.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I actually have it pulled up. Okay, I
Okay.
speak
I was
about
going to
it
say I can pull it up, but
specifically.
you probably know it better.
Yeah, so it's someone engages in a course of conduct or repeatedly commits acts towards another person, including following the person without proper authority, under circumstances that demonstrate, and this is where we differ a little bit from the criminal code. The PFA says unintent to place the other person in reasonable fear of bodily injury. The
Mm-hmm.
criminal code also adds on, or to cause substantial emotional distress. The PFA leaves that part out.
Interesting.
which
You would think the
unfortunately,
PFA would include it and the criminal code wouldn't. Interesting. Okay.
yeah, which unfortunately means I talk about case law a lot, and that's because
Hmm.
as attorneys, what we look at is not only the law itself, but how our courts have interpreted the law.
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, the way that the court has kind of interpreted that is there's stalking and harassment plus a threat of harm or
Right.
plus physical injury. Um, you can look at, we're expanding that slowly but surely, but that's the shortcoming we have. So when I talk about that stalking case that still haunts me to this day, where our PFA was denied, we
Mhm.
had thousands and thousands of emails,
Wow.
phone calls. This defendant drove up from another state, confronted
Wow.
my plaintiff in her neighborhood, um, and the threats were what those of us in the movement see as threats, right? Threats of self-harm on the defendant's part if you don't answer the
Okay.
phone. Um, a lot of coercion, but not explicit threats towards bodily harm towards my client.
Interesting.
And that, again, whether I think it was decided wrongly is a separate issue, but the judge in that case denied the PFA and said, oh, it's a bad breakup.
Wow.
Because they were looking at the past case law that really there was more explicit threats in some of those cases than what was in our case. Now, again, I'm not saying someone in those circumstances shouldn't file a PFA or that I believe it should be granted. But I
Hmm.
think that's kind of the reality of what we sometimes face when filing a PFA and what we might see as a strong case, but one that ultimately was denied and really, I think, speaks specifically to denials we see sometimes around stalking and harassment
Hmm.
is that there's a belief there really needs to be that um, threat of bodily harm um, piece to it, and it needs to look a certain way sometimes. So I think those are the two ways when we're talking about stalking, two main reasons that they'll often be denied if they are denied.
Hmm.
It's either the relation piece itself or some of the shortcoming around how we our definition of
Interpret.
stalking and how it's been interpreted.
Now, we had mentioned, I know we're running shorter on time, but we had mentioned like the civil protections versus criminal. In your case that you mentioned, what is that something that may have fallen under like a criminal charge? Or I guess it really depends on how
I
you
mean,
want to
ideally,
interpret.
absolutely, right? There's multiple charges I would think that should be charged in that situation. The kind of first and foremost charge we have is harassment.
Hmm.
So harassment is continued unwanted contact, right? We sometimes see it when there's like a physical assault and contact. It can be written that way, but it can also be, I told you not to contact me and you've
Hmm.
continued to contact me, which was in that situation very clearly had been happening. So the unwanted phone calls, the unwanted text messages where it had been clearly communicated to stop the contact could have been harassment. We also have crime of stalking. Um,
Hmm.
so again, I think um, a lot of the things in that I described in that case would fall under stalking. It was certainly a course of conduct, repeated actions.
Hmm.
It involved following my plaintiff coming to where she was from states away,
Hmm.
um, and some other tracking of
Hmm.
that client's movements as well. So I think the crime of stalking, which unfortunately we don't see charged as often as we would like, um, that was a little bit unique in that it also involves someone who lived out of state. So
Hmm.
theoretically, the federal stalking um, law could have
Yeah.
also come into play. That we see charged even less because that involves the FBI. investigating and charging. But again, in theory, yes, there's multiple criminal charges,
Mhm.
and I certainly think, if someone feels comfortable reporting to law enforcement, not everyone does for a variety of
Mhm.
reasons.
Mhm.
But if it's a situation where someone does feel comfortable, I think certainly please report it to law enforcement,
Mhm.
because there are, again, not just stalking, but harassment and these other crimes that can be charged in Pennsylvania, and the conduct often falls under one or multiple of
Yeah.
those laws.
Now, if you are experiencing mainly digital stalking, is there like a minimum threshold that has to be met of what you've experienced for it to be charged from a legal standpoint?
The piece that is usually the hang up is going to be that intent piece. So the intent to
Okay.
cause bodily injury or substantial emotional distress. That's
Hmm.
often the hang up of whether it's charged or whether it's not, is proving
Intent.
there was this intent
Yeah.
to it. Now, I think the emotional distress, we would certainly, or I would say, I can make the argument for that. Stalking affects victims so
Mhm.
much in so many facets of their life. Um, but that's more the threshold, rather than like it doesn't need to be a specific number of times.
Hmm.
There does need to be more than once, right? Like some
Hmm.
repeated contact or conduct. But it's that intent piece that tends to be harder sometimes to
Yeah.
show.
So if someone is currently experiencing stalking and is watching, how would you encourage them to protect themselves and or if somebody from the community is watching that wants to support a survivor of stalking, what advice would you give them to help support survivors?
Yeah, I think the first piece, if, and again, it's up to every person whether it's something they want, but if it's what they want, to connect them to their local um, program, their local domestic violence program, so often is the most helpful. Um, because A, folks are available 24/7, but also they are trained to safety plan, which can be such a big piece of this. And I also think, especially with stalking, that first reach out, sometimes it's so important to just have someone who says, I believe you. Like, I hear what's happening, because it can be written off so often. So to be able to talk to, whether it's an advocate or a support group, about what's happening, folks who understand it, who can safety plan and offer resources, I think are so helpful. As a community member, that same piece, right? The really listening if someone's telling you what's going on, and recognizing it and not writing it off is so important. Because so many people I talk to say, oh, people think like this isn't real, or I'm exaggerating, or it's not a big deal. So I think just the simple act of, I hear you, I'm really sorry this is happening. Can I help you think about resources or connect you with someone if that's what you're interested in? Not everyone might be at that
Right.
place where they want that. Maybe they just want to disclose it to you, and that's okay. But really validating what they're experiencing, I think, can be one of the most helpful things, especially if it's possibly the first time that person's even
Speaking
expressing
of,
concerns about what's going on.
yeah, yeah. If you could wave a magic wand and change one policy around stalking, what would you want to see a change on?
I would want there to be, and this is me, Kelsie
Hmm.
specifically, I'm not saying it's a policy of my organization or anything. I would advocate for a stalking only protection order. So similar to our sexual violence protection order, one that was not dependent on a specific relationship, one that, in my ideal world, had a really great definition about stalking
Hmm.
that's not reliant on our criminal code definition, that would allow all victims of
Hmm.
stalking to seek protection
Hmm.
in the way that our current protection order system sometimes falls short. So that wouldn't solve everything, but I think it would be a really helpful piece. And I talk to so many people in my work and also in my personal life who come to me, and I have to tell them the same thing, which is our laws
Yeah.
fall short here. And ideally, if I could change it, it would be that we had, and a lot of states do have it. A lot of states have a stalking specific protection order
Hmm.
that folks can access separate from like their intimate partner abuse order.
I got you. I'm going to put in the chat the PCADV website, our website, as well as our helpline if anyone is from Lehigh or Northampton County. Um, do you have any additional resources that you would like to share or things that you would just like to make sure that people are aware of if they need extra support?
No, I think those are the big ones. I will say again, if you are a victim of stalking or someone who's interested just in learning more resources about stalking, Spark is one that I am a big
Mhm.
fan of.
Yeah, I agree.
Um, and I think they have really great resources, not only the stalking log, but a lot of specific, they call them like handbooks or um, but things written for whether you're a community partner, whether you're an advocate, whether you're a survivor yourself, written for each person about stalking. So I think they can be a super helpful resource.
Just put that in the chat as well. So we always call it Spark as well, but it's
Yeah.
the website itself is stalkingawareness.org. So if you need that, they do have a ton of resources, and we do share their brochures as well with the community as we're able. So, any other final thoughts, resources, concerns, things that you just want people to know how to advocate, whatever you'd like. It's your spot.
No, thanks. I appreciated this conversation so much. I think, there's so many conversations to be had about stalking, and I think the more we have them, the better off we all are. So it was really nice talking to you, and I'm glad we were able to
Yeah.
have this conversation.
Me too. I'm like looking at my list of all the questions we didn't get to, and I'm like, we really could do another conversation with this because it's so dense of just
Yes.
information and how to best support people,
Oh,
and how
one
to
piece we
advocate.
didn't talk
Yes,
about,
go,
and it's such a
go.
small thing, but I will say the newest technology that concerned me, I went car shopping
Hmm.
and the salesman was like, "Oh, we have these great apps now that like you can turn off your car if someone else is driving it or track everywhere it's going." It's really scary. So all that to say, not to
Wow.
freak people out, but again, ever-changing technology, the technology now in cars around location sharing and how they can be controlled is just, I don't know what I meant to say by that, but it just was something that came up recently for me where I was like, this
Yeah.
is ever evolving technology that people will
Yeah.
sell as a really good thing. And in my mind, I'm like, this is horrifying. Please
No,
don't do
no,
this.
please stop. Yeah. I will add, so for anyone who's on now, if you haven't registered, we actually have another webinar tomorrow from 11 to 12 with some of our Turning Point specific advocates. We'll have our legal advocacy director and our supportive services director on. So if you have any additional questions or if as you're processing and thinking about today's conversation, if you have any questions, please feel free to register for that. You can register on our website, on our events calendar, which is just Turning Point LV. I can't type and talk at the same time. turningpointlv.org/events. So you can register there. And then we'll have some other trainings and conversations around teen dating violence coming up in February, as well as digital abuse. So if you want resources to the stalking awareness website, that would be stalkingawareness.org, sometimes called Spark for short. And then I'm also going to share the PCADV website, which is just pcadv.org, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which is like our overarching statewide coalition that kind of supports all of the local chapters of domestic violence agencies, domestic and intimate partner abuse, as well as our website, turningpointlv.org, and our helpline, 610-437-3369, which is 24/7. And we have bilingual advocates as well. So thank you for whoever caught that. I appreciate that. Sorry. Um, yeah, so thank you again, Kelsie, for your time. Thank you, everyone who's here. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out at any time. And yeah, we're here if you need. So thank you again, Kelsie.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone. Stay safe.